"That's the wrong formula, sir." The words sliced through the room before anyone saw who said them. Conversation stopped mid-sentence. Pens froze above contracts. $100 million deal paused on the edge of a whisper. At the front, Harlan Cross, known here only as a technical advisor, turned from the whiteboard, his marker still raised. Around him sat investors, directors, and executives, each one powerful enough to crush a career with a glance. None of them moved. The voice had come from behind the rows of suits. A waitress stood there, tray in hand, eyes fixed on the formula that covered the board. Her uniform didn't match the gravity of her words, but her tone carried quiet certainty. A director broke the silence with a scoff. "Are we taking corrections from the catering staff now?" Nervous laughter followed. Harlan said nothing. His gray eyes studied her, calm but unreadable, as if trying to decide whether she was bold, foolish, or right. Claire didn't flinch. The tray in her hands trembled, but her gaze didn't drop. The room waited, for his response, for her mistake, for the story that was about to begin. Would you have spoken up like Claire did? Tap like and comment I'd tell the truth. Harlan Cross had built an empire out of precision. At 45, he was the kind of man who measured success in decimals and silence. Every project that carried his name ran like clockwork. Every decision was flawless until the last one failed. That failure was small on paper, but it cost him something he valued more than profit: certainty. The report said the formula collapsed because of a minor error. But the real cause, he discovered, was fear. No one had dared to correct a mistake written by a superior. In boardrooms and labs, he began to notice it everywhere. Nervous nods, cautious words, eyes that avoided truth. The company was sick with obedience. So he designed a cure. The next deal, a massive partnership with European investors, would become his quiet experiment. He would attend not as the billionaire CEO, but as a technical advisor. Anonymous, unthreatening, unguarded. Only his personal aide knew. "They need to face the truth," Harlan said, "even if it has to come wearing a different name." He studied his reflection before leaving for the hotel. Without the tailored arrogance, he looked almost ordinary. For the first time in years, he felt something close to uncertainty. He smiled faintly. Let's see who still remembers how to be honest. Claire Summers had once lived inside the quiet rhythm of laboratories. White light, chalk dust, the hum of centrifuges. Equations came to her as easily as breathing. Her professors called her gifted, a mind meant for discovery. But life rewrote her formula. When her father collapsed one winter, tuition turned into hospital bills. She left graduate school without ceremony, trading a lab coat for an apron. At first, she thought it would be temporary. A few months, maybe a year. The months became years. Now she carried trays instead of test tubes. Each night after her shift, she sat by the staff lockers and opened a small notebook. Inside were fragments of her old life, reaction sequences, half-solved equations, notes written in hurried ink. It was the only part of her that still felt alive. Her co-workers called her Professor, half teasing, half cruel. "All that education just to serve coffee," one laughed. Claire smiled softly. She didn't argue. Words couldn't change her place, but silence kept her dignity intact. Sometimes, when the restaurant was empty, she practiced writing formulas on napkins. Her hands still remembered the logic, though her heart sometimes doubted it mattered. That morning, as she tied her apron, her reflection stared back. Tired eyes, a spark still burning behind them. She whispered to herself, "One day, this will make sense again." Then the call came for an extra shift at the Imperial Grand Hotel. A corporate event, they said. She didn't know it yet, but the tray she would carry that evening would hold more than water. It would carry the chance to reclaim everything she'd lost. Harlan straightened his tie in the mirror, the face staring back a careful invention. No one looking at him would see a billionaire. The sharp lines of authority were softened, his name replaced by a simple badge. technical advisor. It was strange how easy it was to disappear once the symbols of power were removed. On the desk beside him lay a folder of equations, the heart of his test. A single variable was misplaced, deliberate and small, but enough to destroy an entire project. He read it again, steady and certain. "A company is only as honest as the people who dare to correct it," he murmured. Across the city, Claire tied her apron, fingers rough from long shifts. She folded her small notebook into her bag, the one with half-finished formulas inside. Her manager barked orders. She nodded, quiet as always. Beneath the uniform, her mind still carried the discipline of a scientist, even if no one saw it. 2 lives, moving on separate tracks, one descending from the top, one rising from the bottom. That evening, they entered the same hotel under different lights. In the grand lobby, Harlan passed through a crowd of executives. Claire stepped out from the staff corridor with a tray balanced on her palm. For a brief moment, their paths crossed. A glance, nothing more than a flicker of recognition, neither understood. Harlan's thoughts trailed behind the polite noise around him. Will anyone here still tell the truth? He adjusted his cufflinks and walked toward the ballroom. Claire followed the same corridor minutes later, unaware that the answer to his question was already walking behind him. The whiteboard gleamed under the ballroom lights, every symbol drawn with deliberate precision. Harlan lifted the marker, his movements calm, unhurried. Each stroke was flawless until the final line. There, he switched 2 variables, a tiny transposition, invisible to the untrained eye, deadly to the equation. He stepped back and let the numbers breathe. "This," he said, gesturing to the formula, "is the sequence that will stabilize replication." His tone carried quiet authority. The room followed it like gravity. He waited. A few consultants exchanged glances, uncertain but unwilling to risk a question. The silence thickened, heavy with calculation and fear. Finally, one executive cleared his throat. "Brilliant, sir. Elegant work?" A murmur of agreement rippled through the group. Smiles followed. No one wanted to be the first to doubt him. Harlan's expression didn't change. Inside, something coiled tighter. He could almost hear the sound of integrity collapsing under politeness. He walked slowly along the edge of the table, watching faces that refused to meet his eyes. "No questions?" he asked. A pause. Chairs shifted. Someone coughed. He repeated, softer, as if to himself, "Not a single one." Returning to the board, he capped the marker and noted something in his leather-bound notebook. 5 simple words. "No honesty in this room." When he looked up again, the executives were already nodding, eager to please. Harlan gave a thin smile, the kind that hid disappointment behind composure. If truth has a voice here, he thought, it must be buried under fear. Claire moved between tables, the rhythm of service guiding her steps. She barely heard the voices of the executives anymore. They all sounded the same, measured, confident, safe. The tray in her hand was steady until her eyes drifted to the whiteboard. Numbers, symbols, something familiar. Her breath caught before she could stop it. The formula stared back at her, and instinct took over. One variable sat where it shouldn't be, a subtle exchange that changed everything. It was the kind of mistake only someone who had lived inside equations would notice. Her pulse quickened. She looked around. No one else had seen it. Harlan stood before the board, explaining details she knew were impossible. Her mind argued with her fear. "Stay quiet. It's not your place." But another voice pressed harder. "If you don't say it, no one will." She took a slow breath and set the tray down. The glass clinked lightly, a sound too small for what came next. Her voice left her mouth before she had time to regret it. "That's the wrong formula, sir." The words cut clean through the noise. Every head turned. Conversation stopped midair. For a heartbeat, no one moved. Claire felt heat crawl up her neck, her fingers trembling. She wished she could pull the words back, But it was too late. A man in a dark suit laughed quietly. Did she just correct the presentation? Another smirked. Must be quite the scientist. Claire stood still, caught between apology and conviction. Harlan turned to face her, the marker still in his hand. His eyes met hers, sharp, unreadable, searching. The room waited for him to crush her. Instead, he simply asked, almost curious, "What did you say?" Laughter broke through the silence like glass shattering. The sound was sharp, mocking, a chorus of disbelief. One of the directors leaned back in his chair, his grin wide. "Are we being taught biochemistry by the catering staff now?" Another voice joined in, smoother, crueler. Maybe she should stick to pouring water. The room rippled with amusement, the kind that feeds on hierarchy. Claire felt the weight of every stare pressing against her. Her throat tightened, but she didn't step back. Her eyes flicked once to the whiteboard, then back to Harlan. He hadn't laughed. He hadn't moved. His gaze was fixed on her, measured and quiet, as if weighing the worth of her courage. He spoke at last, voice low but cutting through the noise. "Do you know who you're speaking to?" The room went still again, laughter strangled in midair. Claire swallowed. Her voice came out steady, though her hands trembled at her sides. "With someone who's about to make a mistake." The words hung in the air, heavier than any accusation. A murmur swept the table, half outrage, half shock. One man whispered, "Incredible," as if watching a slow disaster unfold. Another shook his head. "She'll regret that." Harlan's eyes narrowed, not with anger, but with thought. For a moment he seemed to see through her, past the uniform into something familiar. Clarity, the same kind that once lived in his own decisions. He said nothing. The silence returned, tighter than before. Claire lowered her gaze but didn't retreat. If this was the end of her job, she would at least leave having said what she believed. No one dared move, waiting for Harlan's verdict, and in that stillness the air itself seemed to hold its breath. The laughter died too quickly, leaving behind a strange, heavy quiet. No one dared to move. The air was tense enough to hum. At the far end of the table, one of the European investors leaned forward, his accent breaking the silence. "Is she right?" No one answered. The question drifted across the room like a challenge no one wanted to claim. Eyes turned toward Harlan. Claire's voice came again, quieter but steady. "You switch the variables in the second sequence. It looks fine on the board, but the compound will collapse before replication. The reaction won't hold." She spoke like someone describing a truth, not defending herself. Her words carried the weight of certainty. Harlan stood motionless. The marker rested between his fingers, forgotten. In his mind, the sequence unfolded again. The numbers aligned, broke, then fell apart exactly as she'd said. He checked once more, hoping for a different outcome, but the result was the same. The flaw was real. A faint exhale escaped him. The room waited for denial, for his authority to crush the mistake, but it didn't come. Instead, he looked at the whiteboard, then at Claire. Their eyes met, not in confrontation but recognition. Something shifted behind his calm expression, a small fracture in the perfection he wore like armor. He nodded once, barely visible, as if confirming a private truth. "She's right," he said quietly. A murmur rippled through the group, disbelief followed by uneasy silence. One executive adjusted his tie, another looked down, pretending to take notes. Claire's shoulders eased, not from victory but relief that she hadn't imagined it. Harlan turned back to the board. The smallest smile touched his face. Thin, uncertain, almost human. "Remarkable," he murmured half to himself. And for the first time in years, he felt the weight of being wrong. The meeting broke apart in fragments, voices rising, chairs scraping, a room desperate to rewrite what had just happened. Some executives insisted the formula had only been theoretical, that the technical advisor had been misunderstood. Others whispered about damage control, about how to contain the embarrassment before the investors left the building. One man muttered, "She shouldn't have been allowed near the board anyway." Another added, "Let's focus on the optics." Fear had found a new disguise, self-preservation. Claire stood by the exit, her tray clutched like a shield. The hotel manager stormed toward her, his voice sharp. "Do you realize what you've done? Interrupting a $100 million deal? You could have cost us everything." She tried to speak, but no words came. Apologies felt useless when the truth had already condemned her. The manager pointed to the staff corridor. "You're done for the night." She nodded once and left quietly, her shoes whispering across the marble floor. Behind her, the chaos continued, everyone talking, no one listening. Harlan remained at the head of the table, silent. The marker still rested on the whiteboard ledge, a small reminder of how close arrogance had come to disaster. He didn't look at his executives. His eyes followed Claire as she disappeared through the door. His assistant approached cautiously. "Sir, should I handle this? Have her disciplined?" Harlan's voice was low, steady. "No." He paused, still watching the empty doorway. "She just taught me a lesson." The assistant frowned, unsure whether to respond. Harlan continued, almost to himself. "Everyone in this room saw the error and said nothing. She saw it once and spoke." The assistant waited. Harlan turned to the board, erased the line of the mistaken equation, and stared at the faint trace left behind. He spoke again, quieter now. "Truth doesn't wear a title." For the first time that evening, he felt the exhaustion of pretending to be certain. The noise of the room faded. All that remained in his mind was the sound of a single voice, calm, trembling, and right. The city outside the hotel had gone quiet, but Harlan remained awake, sleeves rolled up, papers spread across the desk. The ballroom lights were off now. Only the glow from his laptop illuminated the numbers that refused to leave his mind. He re-entered the formula from memory, line by line. The sequence unfolded cleanly until it broke exactly where Claire had said it would. The compound collapsed before replication. He adjusted the variables, corrected the order, and watched the model stabilize. The result was flawless. She had been right from the start. He leaned back, the chair creaking under his weight. For the first time in years, a miscalculation didn't anger him. It humbled him. He could still see her face, the tremor in her hands, the steadiness in her voice. Fear and courage, living side by side. The executives had nodded their way through error, but a waitress had risked her job to tell the truth. He whispered into the stillness. A waitress just saved cross tea. The words sounded absurd, yet undeniably true. He closed the laptop, but the thoughts didn't stop. When had he last been questioned without pretense or agenda? When had honesty last walked freely into his presence? The answer unsettled him. He looked down at the small leather notebook on the desk. The last line written there, "No honesty in this room." He drew a line through it. Beneath, he wrote, "One voice still remembered how." For a long time he sat motionless, listening to the low hum of the city through the glass. Tomorrow, he knew, would bring noise, explanations, control. But tonight was different. Tonight, he owed the truth its due. He closed the notebook, exhaled slowly, and made his decision. In the morning, he would reveal who he really was, and who had saved them all. Morning light spilled through the high windows of the ballroom, too bright for the tension it revealed. The investors had returned, their conversations low, guarded. Documents rustled, cups clinked, but no one met anyone's eyes for long. Harlan stood near the board again, his badge still reading Technical Advisor. The disguise felt thinner now, almost transparent, yet he kept it on. He wanted to see how the room would move before he spoke. Every face carried the fatigue of suspicion. The previous night's silence had grown teeth. The hotel staff moved quietly in the background. Claire had been called in at the last minute to replace a sick co-worker. The request surprised her. She thought she had been dismissed for good. On the elevator ride up, her hands refused to stay still. Maybe they just want to make an example of me, she thought. When she entered the room, a few people glanced her way, their expressions unreadable. Her manager gave a curt nod toward the serving table. She lowered her eyes and began arranging glasses, hoping no one would remember her voice. Then she felt it, that same calm presence watching her. She looked up, and there was Harlan, standing by the board, hands clasped loosely behind his back. Their eyes met for the briefest moment. He didn't look angry. There was no trace of the cold authority from before. Instead, a faint smile touched his face, almost invisible but unmistakable. Claire hesitated, unsure what it meant. Relief? Forgiveness? Something else entirely? She turned away quickly, pretending to check the water pitchers. Across the table, Harlan watched her move with quiet efficiency. The executives still whispered, planning damage control. None of them noticed the subtle shift. The only person in the room at peace was the man they thought had been embarrassed. Patience, he told himself. They'll know soon enough. The final signatures were placed, the pens clicking shut with mechanical precision. Applause followed. Thin, forced, the sound of relief rather than victory. Contracts were exchanged, glasses raised, and the investors smiled for photographs they didn't mean. Harlan remained seated for a moment longer than expected. His eyes lingered on the ink drying across the paper, then lifted toward the whiteboard. The formula stood corrected. Flawless now, the same line Claire had defended with trembling conviction. He rose slowly. The conversations faltered, then stopped. Every gaze turned to him. "Before we close," he began, his tone calm, "there's one more correction to make." He reached for the small badge pinned to his jacket, technical advisor. With deliberate care he removed it, placed it on the table, and looked around the room. "My name isn't on this badge," he said. "It should be. I'm not a technical advisor." He paused long enough for the truth to settle. "I am Harlan Cross." The silence that followed was absolute. For a heartbeat, no one breathed. One of the directors blinked, his mouth half open. "Sir, you—" "Yes," Harlan said, his voice firm but steady. "The man you were so eager to please, the one no one dared to correct. That's me." A ripple of realization moved across the room. Shock, disbelief, then shame. The same executives who had laughed at Claire now stared at the floor, their confidence dissolving under the weight of their own silence. Claire froze by the serving table, her hands still on a glass. She looked at him, unsure if she'd heard right. Harlan met her eyes briefly before addressing the room again. "Yesterday, a mistake nearly cost us everything. Not because of ignorance, but because no one had the courage to speak." He gestured toward the corrected equation. "Except one person." The stillness cracked as heads turned toward Claire. Color drained from faces that had mocked her only hours ago. Harlan's expression softened. "The truth doesn't need a title," he said quietly. "It only needs a voice." Harlan let the silence settle until it became unbearable. Every person in the room waited for his next words, uncertain whether they would be absolved or exposed. He glanced toward the far end of the table where Claire stood, small and out of place among suits and glassware. Then he turned back to the room. "She wasn't just right," he said. His tone was measured, but something beneath it carried weight. "She saved this company." The statement struck like a spark. A few executives exchanged uneasy glances. No one moved at first. Harlan continued, his eyes fixed on the faces that had laughed the night before. "You all saw an error and said nothing. You all feared being wrong more than letting the truth be lost. He nodded toward Claire. feared nothing except silence. Claire's throat tightened. She could feel the heat behind her eyes, but she didn't dare wipe the tears that had begun to gather. Harlan's words filled the space slowly, each one landing like a verdict. "I've built an empire on precision, but last night a waitress reminded me what it takes to keep it alive: integrity." From the side, one of the European investors began to clap. The sound was hesitant at first, then firm, echoing through the hall. Another joined him, then another. Within seconds, the entire room was on its feet. Claire stood frozen, unsure what to do. The applause grew louder, surrounding her like light. Harlan inclined his head toward her. "Every number on these pages means nothing if we forget that truth has no rank," he said. The clapping continued until it became more than celebration. It was confession, apology, release. Claire finally looked at Harlan. Gratitude, disbelief, and something softer crossed her face all at once. He gave a slight nod, almost imperceptible, as if to say, "You were right to speak." Her tears fell freely then, not from shame, but from relief. For the first time in years, Harlan felt proud, not of the deal, but of the moment he had finally stopped being the only voice that mattered. The applause faded into a quiet stillness again, but this time it carried no tension, only the weight of realization. Harlan remained standing, his hands resting on the back of his chair. His voice, when he spoke, was calm but stripped of the distance it once held. "I owe you all an explanation," he said. "That formula was wrong because I made it wrong." A stir moved through the room, confusion, then disbelief. "I wanted to see if anyone would question it," he continued. "I wanted to know if honesty still existed in this company, or if fear had replaced it entirely." He let his gaze travel across the table, pausing on faces that refused to meet his eyes. "Now I have my answer." A few directors shifted in their seats. One finally murmured, "Sir, we should have spoken." Another followed, voice low. "We lost sight of what matters." Several heads bowed, quiet apologies passing like ripples across the table. Harlan didn't scold them. He only nodded. "Mistakes can be fixed," he said. "What matters is whether we still have the courage to admit them." He turned then toward Claire, who stood motionless by the serving table, unsure if she should stay. "I didn't expect to find honesty coming from someone the company doesn't even employ," he said. "But maybe that's exactly why it mattered." Claire hesitated, then found her voice. "I only spoke because it was wrong," she said softly. "Not to embarrass anyone. I just didn't want something false to be signed." Harlan's expression softened. "And that," he said, "is precisely why you're worth more than anyone here today." The words landed like a quiet redemption. For a moment, no one spoke. The authority in his tone no longer demanded obedience. It offered respect. Harlan exhaled slowly, a faint trace of humility crossing his face. "If this company is to have a future," he said, "it will be built by people who speak truth, not by those who echo comfort." No one applauded this time. They simply listened, because, for once, power had learned how to bow. When the room finally began to clear, Claire remained where she was, unsure whether she should leave or wait for permission. The air felt lighter now, but her chest was still tight. She had spoken the truth, but she never imagined what would follow. Harlan walked toward her, his expression unreadable but calm. The distance between them closed slowly, the echo of applause fading behind him. When he stopped, he reached into his jacket pocket and took out a single card, white, simple, embossed with the cross T insignia. He held it out to her. "If you still love science," he said, "come to Cross T." Claire blinked, uncertain she'd heard correctly. Her fingers hovered over the card but didn't take it. "I think you have the wrong person," she whispered. "I'm just a waitress." Harlan shook his head once. "No," he said evenly. "You're a scientist who hasn't been given the right lab yet." The words hit harder than any applause. Claire stared at him, her throat too tight to speak. "But I don't have a degree anymore. I left before—" He interrupted gently. "Courage doesn't come with credentials. You saw what no one else did because you were paying attention. That's what this company needs." The card trembled in her hand as she finally accepted it. Her reflection shimmered faintly on its surface, her name not yet written there, but already belonging. Tears blurred her vision before she could stop them. "Are you serious?" she asked quietly. "Completely," Harlan replied. A rare smile touched his face. "Anyone who can correct a billion-dollar mistake while carrying a tray deserves a place where her mind can breathe." Claire laughed softly through the tears. It didn't feel real. The same hands that wiped tables now held the doorway to a life she thought she'd lost forever. "I don't know what to say," she murmured. "Say yes," he said simply. She nodded, her voice breaking but sure. "Yes." Harlan extended his hand. "Welcome to Cross T, Miss Summers." For the first time in years, Claire felt the world shift back into focus, like a formula finally balanced, perfectly right. A year later, the rhythm of Claire's days had changed entirely. The sounds of clinking dishes and hurried footsteps had been replaced by the soft buzz of laboratory machines, the quiet symphony of purpose. She arrived each morning before sunrise, her coffee cooling beside open notebooks filled with chemical sequences. On the pocket of her white coat was her name, Claire Summers, Research Associate, Cross T Industries. The first few months had been difficult. She had to relearn procedures, memorize protocols, rebuild confidence she hadn't used in years. Yet every challenge felt like a gift she refused to waste. The team quickly discovered she wasn't there by luck or by charity. Her ideas were sharp, her logic relentless. When she spoke, she did so sparingly, but her words always landed. Her current project involved developing a compound aimed at slowing neural degeneration. Late nights often found her leaning over data sheets, tracing patterns through exhaustion. She didn't mind. After years of serving tables, fatigue had a different flavor now. It meant progress. At the far end of the main lab, encased in a clear glass frame, hung the formula that had changed everything. The one she had corrected. The error was still there. 2 variables reversed, frozen forever in chalk. Beneath it, a small brass plate bore an inscription chosen by Harlan himself. "Truth begins where fear ends." Each time Claire passed the frame, she smiled. It wasn't pride she felt, but gratitude, a reminder that one moment of courage could rewrite an entire life. She often paused there at night, the lab lights humming above her, the faint reflection of her face merging with that whiteboard from a year ago. Her colleagues respected her not for the story but for her consistency. They saw how she listened before speaking, how she chased accuracy without arrogance. A younger researcher once asked if the rumor was true, that she had corrected the CEO in the middle of a $100 million meeting. Claire only smiled. "I just said what was right," she replied. "Sometimes that's all you can do." Through the glass wall, she could sometimes see Harlan in his office, older now, quieter. He didn't visit the lab often, but whenever their paths crossed, he greeted her not as an employee, but as an equal. "You remind us," he once said, "that brilliance and honesty can still share the same space." Those words echoed in her mind every time she began a new formula. That evening, when the others had gone, Claire lingered again near the framed mistake. The city lights shimmered outside the windows, catching the reflection of the chalk lines. She whispered softly, "We made it, Dad." Then she turned back to her desk, lifted her pen, and began writing another equation, this one flawless from the very first mark.